This is the story of your baby blanket. The first step is about a zillion calculations. I start by determining how big to make the blanket. Since I have a small loom, I have to weave the blanket folded in half, weaving two halves at once. That's a process called double weave, and it means the calculations are doubly complex. Based on all this input, I now know how many yards of fiber I'll need. This blanket is made of bamboo, believe it or not. It's a lovely, washable, soft, and drapey fiber, but it's very thin and fine. I'll need lots of it to make this blanket. Based on my calculations, it looks like I'll need 1,056 threads of warp. Each thread is called an end. This is a warping board. Each thread, or end, must be as long as the blanket, plus quite a bit extra to allow me to tie the ends to the front and back beams of the loom for weaving. Rather than measure each of the 1,056 ends one at a time, we wind the thread in a big continuous loop from peg to peg on the warping board. The warping board is a yard wide, so I'm winding enough to make each thread or end 4 yards long. We'll cut the ends later. 4 yards should give me enough spare yardage to weave a sample and to allow for mistakes, since I'm still a beginner weaver. I wind about 100 ends at a time, then braid them off by hand to keep them from tangling. On the right, you can see each of the braided sets ready to be put on the loom. We're at the back of the loom now. I've laid each braid across the top of the loom. In the right-hand picture, you can see the first arrow pointing to a yardstick that has nails sticking out the top of it. Shelby made that for me, and it's called a rattle. I've clamped it to the top of the loom and am now laying the ends of each braid through it, a few ends at a time. The second arrow points to where I've slipped through 2 lease sticks through the threads. When I wound the threads on the warping board, I did a special crossover every other thread to make a figure 8. The lease sticks keep the figure 8 separated so that none of the threads get out of order or tangled. And the third arrow points to the back beam, and below that, in the shadows, is the take-up beam, where the end of each set of threads is secured. Here's a view from the side. The first picture shows how I've begun rolling the threads, collectively called the warp, onto the back. If you look closely, you'll see slats from plastic window blinds that I've slipped in as I've wound the warp on. This keeps each layer of threads from becoming stuck together. Since they'll be under quite a bit of tension, you don't want them to snag on each other. The second picture is from the front. You can see the braids hanging loose. Shelby helps me with this step. As I wind on in the back, he pulls on the braids to keep them firmly tensioned. Pulling on the braids is a good thing for a boy to do every once in a while. In weaving, an even tension is everything. We want each thread to be wound on at exactly the same tension so the finished blanket will hang evenly. Once we approach the end of the warp and most of it is wound onto the back beam, we are ready to thread the heddles. My loom has 8 wooden shafts. Each shaft will be lifted up and down during the weaving to create the pattern I selected. Each shaft has exactly the number of silver heddles needed for its role in the pattern. I know, I put them there. I counted every one of them and then loaded the shafts exactly in order. Each thread or end must be threaded through the correct heddle on the correct shaft. Since there are 1,056 ends, I have distributed 1,056 heddles to the appropriate shafts, and now I must thread every single one of them. This, for me, is the hardest part. It is really easy to make a mistake, so there's lots of double checking and recounting going on. This alone took me about a week, working an hour or 2 at a time. Phew, that's done. Now I'm ready to slay the reed. We move to the front of the loom, where the beater bar is locked in an upright position. I've inserted a metal reed into the beater bar. Reeds come in different sizes. This one is 12 slots to the inch. If you look closely, you can see it's like a fine metal comb. For this pattern, I need 48 ends per inch, so I must thread 4 ends into each slot in the reed using that special brass tool. The ends must be in exactly the correct order, but that's not too hard. For some reason, I love doing this part. It's sort of like combing fine hair. Plus, I know I'm almost done with warping the loom. The next step is to tie up the petals. Each petal must raise particular shafts. Each little white string is attached to one shaft. At this point, I'm laying on the floor. You can see the carpet down there. I slip the strings into the petal I need to lift that shaft. You can see that on that first petal I'm touching, there are 7 strings secured to it. That means that every time I press that particular petal, 7 of the 8 shafts will be lifted. I'm done scrabbling around on the floor tying up the shafts. Thankfully, that part only lasts a few minutes. Now I'm back at the front of the loom. You can see the ends coming through the reed. I'm now tying them onto the front beam, a small group at a time. This is another point at which tension means everything. I tie them on and adjust each group over and over until all 1,056 threads are at an even tension. Now that the ends are tied on securely at both the back and the front of the loom, I can safely remove those leaf sticks at the back of the loom. They were my safeguard against threads getting out of order or tangled if something went awry during all this threading and slaying. Ta-da! The loom is now warped and ready to weave. Yay! I take some time to wind about 10 or 15 bobbins that will be used in the weaving. The bobbin is that white part inside of the wooden shuttle. As I weave, the bobbin thread, called the weft, will be used up, and I'll just pause and slip in another bobbin and keep on going. Weaving is equipment intensive. My bobbin winder is mounted on the back of my side table. You can barely see it for all the other bits of string, scissors, samples, clamps, shuttles, and other paraphernalia. Finally, I'm ready to weave. If I've got the tension right, the leading edge of the fabric, called the fell line, will be perfectly straight. Things are looking good here. I didn't have to make any adjustments at all. Since I'm doing a double weave, the fabric is folded over. That edge closest to the camera is the fold. The other edge is the 2 open ends. And here you go. I'm weaving your baby blanket. It's kind of noisy, isn't it? You can see me throwing the shuttle back and forth through the fabric. After each throw, called a pick, I release the pedal and pull the beater bar forward to beat the weft thread into place. There you see me working the pedals. That has to be done in exactly the right order. And it takes both feet and a lot of concentration. Kind of like patting your head and rubbing your stomach all at the same time. When I've done a few inches and am ready to wind the fabric forward, I stop to check to make sure I've not accidentally woven the top of the fabric to the part folded underneath. That'll happen in a second now. Okay, I'm stopping. I'm about ready to wind on. So I'm going to take this slat and stick it in and kind of wiggle it as I go to make sure there's no threads that have accidentally tied the top to the bottom. I go all the way to the fold to make sure there's no stray threads that have crossed layers. Here's a close-up of the fabric on the loom. I don't know if you can see it, but the pattern is woven with a set of 3 bumps, then a set of 2 bumps, which are offset. It then repeats 3, 2, 3, 2, 3, 2. It's all over now but the finishing. I bravely cut the threads on the loom and unwind the fabric. It opened out beautifully. No stuck together bits, thank goodness. You'll see a woven seam down the fold line. A more experienced weaver can do a double weave without any seam showing, but I'm not that good yet. I figure the love that went into this will just have to compensate for any imperfections. Next, I carefully roll the cut edges and sew the ends securely so the blanket will not come unraveled. Then I use the same bamboo fiber to crochet a delicate lace edging around the entire blanket. It takes 3 times around the blanket with that teeny tiny crochet hook to create the lace. But I love this part too. I often pray as I do this part. It seems like the perfect way to finish the blanket. And suddenly, it's done. I slipped it into a lingerie bag so it wouldn't snag and washed it on a cold cycle, then laid it across the bed to dry. A quick, very light pressing on the lowest steam setting, and it's all ready for you. May it give you as much pleasure in its use as it gave me pleasure in the making. May God bless you all.